Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast, where we interview growers from all over the world, both beginners and experts, seeking to learn more about what they know about gardening and how they do things in their garden. Hey, what's up everybody? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 136. In this episode, I interview Shane from MIGRO. He was on the podcast once before, episode number 33, back in 2021, where he talked all about LED grow lights. We will continue to talk about lighting in this episode, diving into topics such as Intracanopy lighting, DLI, light quantity instead of quality, and so much more. These podcast episodes are broken up into short clips, and they get placed on their own dedicated YouTube channel called Garden Talk Clips. I also have a gardening channel where I show the plants that I grow. Both of those channels will be linked down in the YouTube description section below. One of my goals for this podcast is to bring free information about gardening to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this episode. Check out their Instant Potting Mix, a soilless grow medium made from 100% organic cocoa coir fiber. It's buffered and triple washed to maintain pH stability and reduce salinity. It comes in a 2-pound brick, which expands to fill up to a 3-gallon grow pot. Click the link in the description section below so you can learn more about their Instant Potting Mix. And the discount code MrGrowIt15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com. Stash Blend. Stash Blend is a 2-1-5 plant additive that can be used with synthetic bottled nutrients or in living soil systems. Simply mix half teaspoon of Stash Blend into a gallon of water, then water your plants with it. Ingredients include corn steep liquor, seaweed extract, humic acid, beneficial bacteria, silica, and mycorrhizal fungi. Check it out at stashblend.com, link in the description section below, and use the discount code THESTASH. And we're back, and I'm joined with Shane from MIGRO LED. How you doing today?
Hey, Chris, doing very well, thank you.
Thanks for coming back onto the podcast. I had to look it up. You were on the podcast in 2021, so several years ago. That was episode 33, and 110,000 views on that episode. It was incredible. And I remember we had so many good topics. We talked about a whole bunch of different things that were lighting related. We talked about grow light testing, the different colors in the light spectrum, diodes, drivers, and so much more. So if you are tuning into this podcast episode and missed that episode, highly recommend you go back to that episode at some point, maybe after you're listening to this one. Go back to that one, tune into it, and there's a lot to be learned there. And I'll link it down in the YouTube description section below like I usually do. This episode, we're going to get into a variety of topics, mostly lighting based. More, I would say, on the intermediate or advanced side of things. But I'm sure that beginners will be able to grasp on some of these things and they'll have some takeaways as well. So figured I'd mention that before we get started. Also, I wanted to ask you if you can introduce yourself for those that didn't catch the first episode we did together.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Shane. I own a company called MIGRO and predominantly make and sell LED grow lights, but also run a channel called MIGRO across YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and try to cover all topics related to grow lighting. Try to do kind of a scientific, informative channel with lots of tips and how-tos and tests and comparisons and all that kind of stuff. And I've been doing it for 7 or 8 years now, so just getting to find my feet.
Yeah, you've been doing a great job over several years now, and I see that plaque behind you. That means you must have passed 100,000 subscribers. Congratulations.
I did. Thank you.
That's awesome. All right, let's dive into some topics. One of the topics that I want to start with is kind of a hot topic here. Intracanopy lighting. It's becoming more and more popular these days. Some say it's worth it, while others say it's a waste of energy and money. What is intracanopy lighting, and what is your overall thoughts on it?
So our typical sort of traditional lighting is from above, and so you'd have your grow tent, you'd have multiple plants in your tent, and typically you try to grow a plane of green, sea of green, so that it'll like a solar panel, it'll capture all the photons from the light source, and of course convert it into energy and into growth. What's happening now is that I suppose the boundaries are starting to be pushed in terms of how much light the plants can take, and to push that to its extreme, people are starting to use intracanopy lighting, which would be lighting that would be positioned either down the side or underneath the plants, and basically lighting it from below or from the side. And the theory is that you can get more growth out of the same square footage. So you can increase your yield per square foot by adding additional lighting underneath and at the side, as I say.
Okay. And would you say it's worth it to do that, or would you say it's not really worth it? You don't really see much of a gain from it?
So, well, I'm just going to take it one small step back in that other research has been showing recently that plants can absorb more light than we previously thought, in particular medicinal herbs. So typically, right way back when you were growing with HPS, we would have been delivering somewhere around 500 to 600 micromoles of PAR. That's a measure of light intensity that plants can use. And with the increased usage of LEDs, and in particular the reduced heat from LEDs, we're kind of able to put a lot more light into grow areas now without the environment suffering. And people have been pushing that up to about 800 or 900 micromoles, so nearly twice as much. And that's over the last 3 or 4 years. And now the most recent sort of study and practice by commercial growers and people pushing the performance of the plants, I found that you can comfortably go up to about 1200 micromoles on a 12-hour cycle, which is about, it's nearly 50% more again. So about 2.5 times what we used to only 5 or 6 years ago. And one way of achieving that, particularly if you have invested in a system of lighting from above, which is delivering, say, that average of about 800 or 900, is to add additional light fixtures underneath and on the side. And in that case, if your per square footage of micromoles is hitting about 1200, that's a good return. You could push it a little bit higher than that, but you're starting to get a reduced rate of return the more light energy you're putting in. The plants aren't able to absorb all that. But yeah, I think there's huge potential for growers to basically push to get 50% more yield from the same area that they're growing in today.
That's pretty interesting. And I'll be completely transparent with you. I did try side lighting several years back. Chill Tech came out with one. They came out with 2 different ones, actually. And I tried using it. And I'm just a small home grower, so I'm only really growing for myself. And the yields I get just naturally with overhead lighting is sufficient for me. And so I quickly used and then got rid of my side lighting. I can see how it would be a benefit for, commercial facilities or those folks that maybe you are a home grower and maybe you've maxed out that grow space and you've gotten the highest yields you think you can ever get out of that grow space. Well, that might be for you to introduce intercanopy lighting at that point. But for somebody like me who's a small home grower, I don't see myself ever going back to intercanopy lighting just because I'm able to get what I'm looking for in regards to yield just from overhead lighting. So I think I mentioned that one.
And I would tend to agree with you. And for most growers, I would only recommend that sort of 800 or 900 average. And that's, how I design my lights is to deliver that, because the analogy that a lot of people use is this sort of driving a Ferrari, that when you start to get up to those really high power numbers, the difficulty is if you have a bottleneck somewhere else. So if some other part of either your environment control or your nutrients or even your growing medium is not able to support that growth rate, then you're not going to deliver it. So I'd be right there with you that for some growers who are able to push that performance and want to push it further, absolutely. For most, I wouldn't recommend it either.
Really good point. Yeah, your plant is only going to grow as fast as your limiting factor, right? And for most folks, their limiting factor is CO2, which we're going to get into later on in this talk. But yeah, really good call out there. Next, I would like to dive into DLI. So break it down for us. What is DLI and what's the target for those growing medicinal varieties?
Yeah, so DLI is simply the sum of light the plant will receive over a light cycle. And when we're talking in parts, micromoles, the units can get a little bit confusing. But if you go back to what I was speaking about earlier about this sort of 800 or 900 micromole average that most growers are growing at today, that equates to, if you multiply that 800 by the time in the day, literally the amount of seconds in that day, you'll get the micromole number. So you multiply the 800 by 60 seconds, by 60 minutes, by 12 hours, and you get around 35 moles. And that's another way of looking at your light intensity, is how much the plant's receiving over that light period. And as I was saying earlier, new studies are showing that you can probably push that up to about 60 moles per day. So almost double what we're doing at the moment, without needing to have any sort of sophisticated environment controls, such as elevated CO2 or anything like that. And that's a very high power intensity, a very high amount of light that plants can absorb, and medicinal herbs are an exception in that regard. For example, tomatoes, which are known as, and chilies, and those sort of plants that are known as very high light demanding plants, commercial growers wouldn't push them beyond about 40 moles per day. So it shows that medicinal herbs really have a unique capability of absorbing a lot of light and converting it efficiently, which is, as I said, could be a real benefit for growers, particularly in a smaller area where they want to push higher production out of a small space.
Got it. And DLI, you mentioned the calculation, and just for reference, folks can Google DLI calculator, and you'll be able to easily find several websites that actually have a calculator on there where you can put in the inputs, and then it will spit out what the result is. I'm on one of them right now, and I just wanted to talk about this. So a PPFD 900 time I put for 12-hour light cycle, if you calculate that, that's a 38.88 DLI. Now, if you are going to 18 hours per day, right, still 900 ppfd, you're up to a 58. So you're close to that 60 that you mentioned for DLI. What really throws people off, I think, is autoflowers, right, is because they're on the same light cycle the entire time, yet we hear about you needing to increase light from the vegetation stage to the flower stage. So, for example, right, let's say that you are on an 18-hour light cycle, and that you are you keep it on 18 hours and you bump it up to 1200 ppfd, right? Because you're running CO2 or whatever. Then you're at a 77 DLI, so beyond the 60 that people are kind of getting away with. I've heard some people go up to 65, but for the most part, a lot of people are falling into the trap of light stress. They're just going by ppfd, not taking DLI into consideration, and then their plants are suffering because of it. So highly recommend folks play around with that calculator, kind of see what ppfd you're giving the plants and how many hours, and calculating it and kind of seeing where you're falling in there, because it can certainly be kind of surprising once you get the calculator involved. Yeah,
and just to say, with autoflowers, so typically growers would probably run for about 20 hours per day light cycle, leaving 3 or 4 hours for a night period for the plants to rest and recuperate between light cycles. I would generally recommend about 550 micromoles in that case, which is pushing up to about that 40 DLI. But also with the discussion about vegetative and flowering and moles per day, I would say that push the plants as hard as you can. So, if you have a light that's capable of delivering 1,000, 1,200, whatever it is, get it up as high as you can, as early as you can, even through the veg stage, and just look for signs of light stress. Making sure at the same time that you're keeping up with the demands of the plant. It's going to respire more. It's going to basically need more water. It's going to need more nutrients because it's growing faster, and just to be careful not to misdiagnose light stress with possibly some other factors. Back to the sort of reference points, we're talking about running at 900 micromoles average power. The sun is 2000 at midday. So plants are well able to take very high power intensity without being damaged. However, if you are running them, as I said, at a very high performance level, other factors may come into it and you may be restricting them in other ways. Lots of fresh air or elevated CO2, and being very careful with that you give them enough water, that you keep the humidity down, because it's going to be respiring a lot, and keep the nutrients up.
Good call outs there. So that's light quantity, right? That's the density of photons coming down onto the plant. That's one thing. And then there's light spectrum, often referred to as light quality. The light spectrum is often a main focus point when shopping for a grow light, right? But some claim that the priority should really be light quantity instead of quality, right? So the density of photons versus the spectrum of light. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I would agree. So in terms of these power photons that we're talking about, they're in the range between 400 and 700 nanometers, strictly speaking. That's blue, green, and red photons, basically. And if all of them are present, you're going to get white. You're going to get white light. And most LEDs these days are white LEDs, supplemented usually with 660 nanometer reds. Those reds are sometimes confused as being somehow they promote flower, or they force the plant to flower, or they make it flower better. It's not true. The reason we add the 660 nanometer reds is because they're highly electrically efficient. That means they deliver a lot of photons per watt. And you can think about them a bit like a little photon turbo that you'd have in your lighting system. We add as much as we can afford. They're much more expensive than white lights. But they'll give it that, as I said, that boost in terms of efficiency. But there's lots of evidence has accrued now, with published studies showing that you could have a range all the way from a very warm white spectrum, so similar to what HPS would be, so quite a small proportion of blue, a lot of green and a lot of red. You could have a range from that spectrum all the way up to a very cool white, which would have a lot of blue in it, so up around the 20-25%. That would have been typical in metal halide. And you will get almost no difference in terms of growth rate, and you will get no difference in terms of quality of harvest. So the potency of what's harvested will be exactly the same, irrespective of which spectrum you choose in that range of spectrum available. So it has very little difference. Outside of that, there are arguments about the spectrum of light can affect not just the growth of the plant, but the shape of the plant and the characteristics of the plant. So there's some belief out there that, for example, far red, again, can do something special in terms of the way the plant develops. And far red typically can cause plants to stretch. Far red is you get very high levels of far red in shade in nature, and that would signal a plant to get out of the shade and into the sun. So it's a shade avoidance response it causes, and it can cause plants to stretch. That could be useful in early stages of growth. You want to get that canopy out. You want to get that plant to extend, to fill up the surface area of your tent, to expand that solar panel out and gather all the light from your grow light. So in some cases, there may be an argument for using far red at early stages to promote that sort of growth. And then there's discussion around UV. So again, not typically present in your standard LED grow light, but you can supplement it with special fixtures which would have UVB and UVA. UVA performs a little bit like blue. It isn't. There is some evidence that it may help strengthen your plant, so it can strengthen the cuticles. That's the little parts where the branches come off, and make them a little bit stronger. Your plants are less likely to, or the branches are less likely to snap. And UVB has been shown to, in some cases, not all cases, to cause, again, what's kind of known colloquially as a sunscreen response, and that is for the plant to produce more oil. And that would be in the form of terpenes and flavonoids. So basically you get more sticky harvest with higher levels of terpenes, so better taste and smell with terpenes and flavonoids. There's evidence of that in a lot of strains, but there's also evidence that with some strains that you don't get that response by using UVB. So I would generally, again, if you're going for your basic standard home grower, I'd say don't worry too much about spectrum. Pretty much all grow lights these days are using the same spectrum. That's for a reason, because it works for everybody. And don't fuss about it too much. Don't worry about it too much. What's much more important is the power intensity. So it's the amount of light that the fixture is delivering. And just look at the grow light manufacturer should be providing a power map. So they should be showing the power distribution over its specified area. So say it's a 750 watt light going into a 5x5. It should show that light in its optimum hang height over a 5x5 space and give you a grid showing the power intensity right across the area of your target plant canopy. And you should look for even distribution and high intensity.
Got it. And if folks really want to get down to the nitty gritty of the individual light and the light spectrum and how they impact a plant, we covered that in the past episodes. So highly encourage you guys to tune into that episode after this one, because Shane breaks it down. Everything from blue, red, UV, IR, all that stuff is broken down and how it impacts the plant. It was really, really great talk there. So just wanted to mention that again. Now, one thing in the last Garden Talk episode that you talked about is that was back in 2021. You had mentioned that back then, grow lights had enough far red in them that there really isn't a need to add additional far red, like supplemental lighting there. Do you feel that's still the same case here in 2024?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So since then, there's more evidence has come out that far red is photosynthetic. So the photons beyond that strict power range of 700 nanometers up to about 750 nanometers, they cause photosynthesis. However, they cause photosynthesis at a lower rate, so they're less efficient in terms of causing photosynthesis than, for example, red or green or blue photons. So investing and spending extra on additional far red LEDs within a fixture, in my view, is a waste of money. You're not getting the growth and the yield return from that extra investment that you would by just simply buying a fixture with more white LEDs or red LEDs, for example. And the other factor is that pretty much all white LEDs, they have a little tail of far red just at the end of their spectrum, typically about 2 or 3% far red in it. So if you really desperately want to have far red for some reason, there already is some there. As I said, if you do add too much far red, and that it's a trade-off here, by the way, or it's a balancing act between blue and red. So if blue will cause short, dense growth, far red will cause stretching. If you have a lot of blue, you can afford to put a lot of far red in there, because the far red shouldn't cause stretching in that case. But if you don't have a lot of blue and you put too much far red in there, you'll have stretched plants. And that's an inefficient way to grow, because really what you want is flowers. And putting energy into more stalks and more leaves and sort of more height is a waste of energy. So again, in my view, I don't think there's a strong argument for adding far red LEDs to a fixture whatsoever.
And sometimes it can actually make it a little bit more difficult to grow, just because you've got those long, stretchy ones, and once the buds kind of build up on it, it could become so heavy that they just start flopping over. Happens with a lot of OG strains. I battled that in the past, where I had to put support stakes and then tomato cages and all that stuff. So it can be a challenge when you have those long stretch in flowering. Getting those heavy buds, it can be a little bit challenging on that avenue.
Yeah, well, I remember back in the HPS days, and I'd switch over to HPS, and then it was just a 8-week battle for trying to control everything and trying to, as you say, tie everything down and get it away from the heat and all that stuff. So yeah, we have really good spectrum now with LEDs. We can tailor it. Let's not mess it up.
Now, you touched upon UV lighting and you kind of answered the question I'm about to ask. Well, I want to ask it a little bit more direct, which is you mentioned that with the far red, it's not really worth adding a supplemental lighting, in your opinion. Would you say that's the same for UV? Is there enough UV light in most fixtures these days that it's not really worth it to buy supplemental UV bars?
Well, you don't get any UV from white LEDs or red LEDs. So the UV LEDs would have to be added in. There's only really efficient UV LEDs in the range which is just below 400 nanometers, so around 385 or 390 nanometers. It's basically blue. Plants see it as blue, and it doesn't affect either the growth very significantly, so it's not very photosynthetically efficient. So it's not going to add to your yield, it's not going to add to your growth rate, and there's yet to be strong evidence that it has any significant health benefit for your plants or in terms of potency. UVB is slightly different. UVB is not really achievable using LEDs, at least not commercially viable now yet. So typically people would use fluorescence to deliver UVB, and that's a very cheap and efficient way of doing it. There is strong evidence that it will, and again, this is strain dependent. So my experience is going to a commercial grower actually in the UK, and it was with medicinal herbs for CBD varieties. And it was actually a Canadian parent company which was trialing the use of UVB. And they were demonstrating, in some cases, up to 40% increase in terpenes and flavonoids. And they were using it for oil extraction. So it's obviously very commercially beneficial for them to be able to get a lot higher extraction rate from the plants. But in some strains, they saw very little response. However, it's a fairly cheap addition, very cheap to run. So you'd need approximately about 20 watts of fluorescent in a 5x5. And that would be to deliver a UVB intensity of about half what midday sun would be outdoors. And just for a couple of hours a day in the last few weeks of flowering to stimulate that response from the plants. Anecdotally, a lot of customer, I sell one, so this comes with a warning, but I get a lot of customers anecdotally coming back to me and saying they've had good results with it, and I've had some say they haven't had any result at all. So it depends. It's strain dependent. I don't have any data on which ones respond and which ones don't, and why. But there definitely is cases where it can be a pretty efficient and cheap way of boosting the quality of your harvest.
That's really interesting. Good to know all that. And yeah, it makes sense that the strain would be dependent on the strain, right? It's like these plants, there's so many different varieties and they react so differently to all the things that we throw at them, whether it be lighting or whether it be the environment or whether it be the nutrition. So yeah, the way the plant expresses itself, I can imagine that it's different for each cultivar.
Yeah, well, a commercial, this facility that I traveled to, they were also selling to supermarkets, and they were selling basil, rosemary, sage, all these different herbs for supermarkets. And the biggest response they were getting was actually from rosemary. And you may know yourself, like we've got a little herb garden at home. It grows under sort of a little plastic kind of greenhouse we have out in the back garden in the winter, just to keep it away from the frost. But until that is brought out into the sun and hardened, as gardeners would say, you won't get that stickiness on the leaves. It needs that UVB to stimulate the oil production as well. And you do actually see it particularly at winter time. If I buy rosemary from a supermarket, it'll be sort of a dry, almost leathery surface to the leaves, rather than that sort of sticky, gooey surface. And that's because it's grown inside in greenhouses, and UVB doesn't transmit through the glass. So, as I said, from a commercial point of view, there are a lot of facilities which are installing UVB into their facilities to supplement the light that's coming through the glass and deliver UVB to stimulate this oil production.
Huh, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. I want to shine away from talking about light for a few and talk about some other things that relate to growing plants. One of the things I want to get into is CO2. Now, you've been doing some experiments or research into supplementing CO2. Talk to us about your findings.
Well, on a personal basis, I have failed dramatically in all my experiments to prove the benefits of CO2. So I haven't yet had first-hand experience of seeing the benefits. I've had it in the early stages of growing. So I've done it with chili plants, and I've grown side by sides, same strain of chilies, so cuttings in the same media, same environment, one with elevated CO2 and one without. And what I saw in the early stages was definite increase in growth rate in the sort of vegetative stage for the chili plants. But then I saw that once it started flowering and fruiting, that advantage or that increased growth rate seemed to come back, to reduce. So that's my experience, and I've failed publicly at doing that on a few grow comparisons I've done online. However, people who are much better than me and more capable than me have grown. In particular, Dr. Bruce Bugby and Mitch Westmoreland in Utah State University. Some of the very few people who actually published their results, and that's again growing with medicinal herbs. And they've shown that there's an up to 30% increase in growth rate if you elevate the CO2 level from what's in the environment, which is about 420 parts per million, up to about 1200 parts per million. And that's all other things being equal. So if you are in the fortunate situation where you can have a closed environment for your grow room, you can potentially use what is a fairly cheap input, CO2. So using a hot burner, basically a little gas pilot burner to produce the CO2, or you can use it cold from basically a bottle of compressed CO2 you can get from a welding suppliers. So you can do it in two different ways, and potentially it's a very cheap input to get a big increase in growth rate. Plants don't use a huge amount of CO2 in terms of mass. So you could, for example, be using a bottle of propane might cost $20 or $30, and it could be feeding your grow room for the 3 or 4 months that you're running a grow. And you could be getting an increase in growth rate potentially of 30% for $20 or $30. So it's huge potential there. The difficulty is for small growers. It adds a level of complexity, because if you are running a CO2 burner, it's going to add heat to your grow room. It's also going to add moisture. So you get CO2, but also H2O when you burn the gas. And so you have to have environment control. You have to be able to take that humidity out, and you don't want to be expelling the CO2 that you're producing. So you need to have basically air conditioning systems set up where the air conditioning is of the more sort of sophisticated kind, where it has the radiator is outside of either the grow room or the lung room, which is out of, it's a bit sort of higher technical level than a lot of people are willing or able to do. And again, I wouldn't be advising people to do that. If you want more growth, maybe just add a little bit more area to your tent. Maybe push power intensity a little bit higher, or even just change the medium that you're using to a more efficient medium. Lots of other ways to get an increase in growth rate. However, if you've explored all those options and you really want to push it further, it definitely has potential. Yeah.
I completely agree. I've played around with adding CO2 off and on over the years, and I've used everything from those CO2 mushroom bags to the T&B natural canisters that you you shake up every day and put on there. It's very hard to measure, right? There's not a lot of companies out there making good CO2 monitors where you can measure a result. And
actually, it's not a direct CO2 sensor, but I don't really understand the technology, quite honestly, but there's a lot of sensors around now, and you'll see them online as air quality sensors, and they're able to detect CO2 levels pretty accurately. You get them for about $100. So the measurement is getting easier, and in fact, what we were talking about earlier about light stress, I think in a lot of cases it's potentially actually the plants are being starved of CO2, and I think it would be quite useful, particularly with large growers. These big sort of 8x8 tents and stuff. You got dead areas in that tent. It's very hard to move around the air sufficiently that you're going to replenish the CO2 in every place. So I would recommend for those who are sort of pushing the limits to, if you can, invest in a CO2 sensor and just keep an eye on it, because it could be a restrictive factor for you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have a CO2 monitor by the company is actually called CO2 Meter. And it's an older one. It's probably about this big, maybe for those just listening in. It's got to be about 6 inches. It's roundish. And that is something that I've been using. But, I'm not in a sealed room. So it's like, me using the CO2 canisters and using the exhale bags, it's like, it's up and down result. Like every time I went in there, it would be either be elevated, 700, 1200, great, or it would be normal level. And I'm like, it's just so hard for me to measure it as a home grower. And like I mentioned in the beginning, I don't need the yield. Yeah. I don't need a 30%. So like, I think it's situational. The reason why I bring this up is I think it's situational. A lot of people hear about these things that help with growth rate and stuff like that, and they automatically apply it in there because they feel like they need to. But look at your own personal goals, right? If you're already achieving the yield, then why bother investing into it? Another thing folks don't really realize is if you're a home grower like me, you're exhaling CO2, right? So like CO2 levels, every time I go in there, it's elevated just because I live here. I have a fiance that lives here. I have a cat. I have a daughter now. So we're all exhaling CO2 that's contributing to my grow room and the plant growth that's happening there. So I think I mentioned those things. It's like, it's fantastic that we're finding out all these things about CO2 and that it's increasing that much. And I'm totally with you. If you're looking to get it up to that next level, add CO2. Absolutely. But it's not for everybody, is what I feel like. So.
And I did do a test of those mushroom bags. I just did one literally today. I just posted one today. Company wasn't happy with my previous test, sent me another one to test, and I found out the same thing, that this is one of these. It's got straw and mycelium in it, and you blow air through it, and you get this. They don't work. They'll elevate it for a short time, and this is in a sealed tent, but it drops away pretty quickly. Really, the only way effectively to do it, as I said, is with a burner or with CO2 bottles. All those other methods are, they're not very efficient.
I'm glad you uncovered that. Yeah, let us know about that. That's good. I'm glad there's guys like you that are actually doing studies on it to see whether or not it works or if we're being fed snake oil here.
Snake oil, unfortunately.
Let's transition over to temperature. So temperature within the plant's environment can greatly impact growth rate. Talk to us about crop steering with temperature.
Yeah, so again, fascinating research coming out of Utah State University. I interviewed both Bruce Bugby and Mitch Westmoreland, two people who have been working on with very sophisticated equipment to test, do controlled tests of varying different environmental factors and seeing what effect they have on both growth rate and yield and quality. And the temperature is particularly difficult to do because you have to have the same conditions but in separate rooms with environmental control, and quite expensive to do as well. But they've done really extensive testing on a number of different cultivars, and they've demonstrated there's two parts to it, I suppose. First of all, is generally between about 20 degrees centigrade, so about 68 Fahrenheit, and about 26, 27 degrees centigrade, so about 85 Fahrenheit, is optimum for growth. If you increase it in that range, you will get a higher growth rate. So the general idea is to start warm. So you want to get those plants to put out their canopy as quickly as possible. You want to get them to get up to as large a size as possible before you flip or before they start to flower. However, once buds start forming, buds are peculiar in that they're effectively like a ball of leaves, tightly packed together, and they have a difficulty in losing their heat and also losing moisture, so respiring, because there's a large density and a small surface area, rather than a leaf, which is a very low density and a high surface area. So these buds have a difficulty in getting rid of heat and respiring. Also, buds tend to be at the top, and they tend to absorb that bit of radiant heat coming from, in particularly if you're using HID. They can be 3-4 degrees centigrade, 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the temperature of the room, because they're absorbing that heat, but they're not able to expel that heat. So what is advised now is to reduce down the temperature down around 20 degrees centigrade or 68 Fahrenheit for at least the second half of flowering, if not earlier. So once those buds are starting to form and become dense. And what they've shown through extensive studies is that if you do run hotter than that, there's a very steep drop off in its ability to retain cannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids. So effectively, the quality of your harvest will reduce if you're running too high a temperature in the latter sort of half of flowering, and it's really dramatic. Unfortunately, it's a little bit layered, because it does depend on strain, and different strains tolerate different ranges of temperature. So there's sort of like a 5 degrees centigrade range of tolerance. So some will prefer it to be 25, some will need to be down at 20 to retain that potency. But if you go from say the optimum in terms of retaining a potency is at 20 degrees centigrade. If you go to 25, it can drop by over half. So you can have a 50% reduction in the potency of your harvest if you're running 5 degrees warmer than the optimum for the plant. So it's quite dramatic. It was something that I used to hear a lot anecdotally from growers. You'd often hear, I get a much higher quality harvest in winter, for example. In summer I struggle. And there's an underlying reason for that, and there's now evidence to support that. So it's very interesting and very useful for growers to know. Difficulty for growers, is another layer of difficulty for them, is trying to get that temperature down in flower, and trying to get it down to 20 degrees. Most people's homes will be over 20 degrees centigrade. They'll be 22, 23 degrees, where we find it comfortable, 70, 75 Fahrenheit. So it needs air conditioning effectively to cool it down. Not possible for a lot of people, but there are some fairly easy methods of at least being on the lower end, or as low as you possibly can. One of them is operating your light schedule at night. So your house, the air you're pulling in from outside, if you are, will be cooler at night. So it gives you a better opportunity to bring that temperature down, and high rates of airflow. So we do want humidity to be down as well in that second part of flowering. And if you are doing that, you're probably pulling through air pretty quickly through the tent, and therefore keeping the temperature down. But it's not possible for everybody. All I would say is just try and keep your temperatures as low as possible for that phase of growing.
Man, 68 degrees Fahrenheit for the second half of flowering. That's probably eye-opening for a lot of people listening to this. I've heard about lowering the temp towards the end of flowering, the final couple weeks of flowering, because like you mentioned, the higher the temp, the more terpene loss and flavonoid loss that's happening, right? It's just evaporating, right? It's going into the air. But 68 degrees, I mean, that's 10 degrees lower than what was generally recommended. So,
by me too, by the way. So I would have been recommending that higher temperature up to very recently until I got this new information. And those studies they're not actually fully published yet. Again, the guys in Utah State have released the information. Mitch Westmoreland from Utah State has done a few podcasts, including my own, where he's shown his results with two different cultivars, and it's the evidence is plain and clear.
So with the quality going up, yield has to go down. Was it measured, like how much of a yield loss there is running that lower?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So what they, and I don't fully understand this, and I'm not going to pretend to, but what I gathered from what I was told is that there's two things working against each other or for it, whichever way you look at it. So the relatively lower temperature in flowering it actually promotes the plant to push resources basically into the flowers. So you may not get a total massive plant at the end, but you're pushing the plant to put its energy where you want it to, which is into the flowers with that lower temperature. And there's less of an effect once you get into that sort of 20 to 26 degrees centigrade, or sort of 68 to 75, 80 Fahrenheit. The difference in growth rate between the lower and upper range there is not huge. So you're not losing that much in terms of mass of plant by reducing it at that stage. And as I said, it's on balance, it's far more beneficial to have a lower temperature than a higher one.
Looking forward to seeing the final results on what they come out with. Let's get into measuring light. I have a few questions for you here. Lumens. Is measuring lumens beneficial at all, or should growers stop measuring lumens entirely, right? So a lot of people used to use lumens, not anymore though.
Yeah, so as I said before, PAR, as in the particles of light that cause growth, are in about the range of 400 to 700 nanometers, and they're more or less absorbed equally within reason. So blue, green, and red photons are absorbed at a very similar rate. However, the eye and look sensors, they are much more sensitive to green than blue or red. So they will see green more effectively than they will blue and red. Having said that, I wouldn't discourage somebody from using a lux meter if they're trying to particularly look at intensity across their grow area. Using a lux meter will show you the relative values of light intensity across that grow area very accurately. So if you want to, for example, look to see what your intensity is in the corners, or if you've got a large grow area and you're mapping out lights and trying to cover your canopy evenly, using a lux meter is a perfectly good solution for that. If you want to see what your actual power number is, there is a correlation between what a lux meter will read and the power number. It's basically a factor you can multiply the lux reading by. I've got a blog on my website and on the YouTube channel showing you how you can use a lux meter to measure power effectively. So you measure lux and then just multiply it by a number. You can also use it in conjunction with an app. So if you're on Android or iOS now, actually, there's an app called the PPFD app. It's a guy I've worked with a little bit in the past, and you can pair what is a cheap and readily available lux meter called the Unity. It's the Bluetooth version, and you can pair that to the app, and you'll get at least 95% accuracy in terms of the power numbers. I've tested it with various different light sources, extensively, and they're pretty accurate. But there's also a number of apps you can use with your phone too. So again, there's the what was the Photon app? I can't remember. They changed it to, I can't remember. It was called the Photon app, but there's one on iOS, which is quite accurate. You have to use basically a piece of paper over the front camera as a diffuser. So you basically just sellotape a little bit of paper over the front camera on your iPhone, and you can use that as a power meter, and it'll be perfectly adequate for most home growers. And the PPFD app, you can do the same now across Android and iPhones. So it's relatively easy to do. There are other sensors. I've just done an extensive test of 6 power meters, comparing the Lycor, which is like the industry standard $1,500 one, with the Apogee, which is like the $600 one, with the Spot On, which is the $350 one, with the Photon, which is the $160, I think, and a couple of other ones which were cheaper and not very good. But those higher priced ones, the difference in accuracy between the $1,500 meter and the $160 meter is only about 5%. And if you're growing at home, 5%, 95% accuracy on a power meter is all you need. So you can do it for $160. Buy them on Amazon. It's the Hydro Farm Photo Bio power meter. You want to get a little bit more accurate, you can use the Spot On, which is, again, I've used here extensively, and on you go. But you only really need to be spending big bucks if you're a commercial grower and 5% means something to you, Otherwise, you can do it pretty cheaply and easily.
I'm glad to see that there are more affordable options coming onto the market when it comes to measuring light. I mean, geez, warp back 5 years ago, and Apogee sensor was the cheapest you could get, right? Hit the 600. So I have 2 different models of them, and at first they were only 400 to 700, and then they came out with the one that extends beyond that, because we found out that PAR extends a little bit beyond that, so that was good. That's the one I have. But yeah, it's really good to see that they got the Spot On meter, which is cheaper, and then the other ones you mentioned, and actually using your phone to get an idea of what the light levels is, even if it's only 95% accurate. I mean, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, it is. For all intents and purposes, you're able to adequately and reliably measure light. How to use it, though, is the next thing, and that's where people come a little bit unstuck, I think. Again, I got a little tutorial on our YouTube channel about using power meters, but really what you want to do is, first of all, measure your center point. So most lights are going to have higher intensity in the center. Even LED bar lights in around the center is going to be higher, and want to trade off dropping your light as low as possible to get as much light down onto the plants, because if the light's up very high, light will bounce around and be lost. It'll go every other way except hitting the plant canopy. So getting it down nice and low is very beneficial. Dropping, for example, from about 24 inches down to about 12 inches will improve the amount of light, even with reflective walls in a grow tent, by about 10 to 15%. So you can get real benefits or improvements in efficiency by optimizing that light height. So you're checking the center measurements and then just checking the corners, really, the corners and the edges. Because there's no point in getting really high light intensity in the center of your tent and then all the plants around the periphery are suffering. So trying to do that trade-off. And generally, I would say you're trying to get in the corner about half the maximum number in the center. It's not possible to get 100% uniformity, so don't try, it won't happen. And it's okay to have that fall off. It'll fall off fairly gradually to the edges. So if you're getting 50-60% of the intensity in the center out in those corners, you've pretty much got it optimized.
How much PAR in PPFD do you generally recommend for the different stages of growth when growing medicinal varieties?
So very young plants, seedlings, you can push it very high, but I don't advise it, again, because you're stressing them. And, they're delicate and they can be quick to turn. Things can go bad pretty quick with a little seedling. So generally I'd recommend 250 to 350 micromoles for seedlings, and that's plants up to about 2-3 weeks old. So until they're like sort of 6 inches high, you're kind of getting little woody branches. You've got maybe 4 or 5 branches coming out on top of each other, stacked. From then, it's push them as hard as you can, as quickly as you can, and it's all strain dependent. So I try not to give a definite number, but you should be trying to get up to full par intensity by about week 6, somewhere around that region. So from 2 or 3 weeks old, you should be pushing on that light intensity up incrementally to at least 80% by week 6, and possibly by 100% strain dependent, as I said. All you need to do is just keep an eye out for light stress. And light stress, we get a lot of people, as a grow light supplier, I get people coming back saying, my plant, it's burning my plants. And I tell them, unless the plant is within 6 inches of the light bar and you're at 100%, it is not light burn. I have grown plants, within, 4 inches at 100%, where it's 3,000 micromoles directly under that light bar, and they're still not light burn. It needs to get up to that sort of at least above 2,500, maybe 3,000 micromoles before you'll start to see actual light burn. And you'll know it because it'll only be on those spots which are very close to the light. It won't be all across your canopy. And quite often I'd see, people would send me in pictures to sort of try and diagnose what the problem would be. And you can see that all of the plant is affected. It's not just these little peaks. Your canopy isn't perfectly flat, and it's not all getting exactly the same light intensity. So if you are seeing spots directly under the light, or where the light is emitted directly under the bars, very close to the bars, that probably is light stress. And raise the light. That's all you need to do. Raise it 6 inches. And just be sure that you're not causing that plant damage, or bend that particular part over, or trim it, or whatever. But it's very rare that you would get light stress. So it's far more likely that you're going to see other symptoms, and it would be symptoms, as I said, of underwatering, overwatering. Most of what I see is too much nutrients. That it's very hard to diagnose, over a WhatsApp message or an email photograph, whatever. But from when I go through all of the different factors that the grower has in place, quite often, in my view, it's actually too much feeding.
All right, good to know. So I asked you this next question in our last episode back in 2021, and it's been 3 years later now. So I figured I'd ask you again, what does the future look like for grow light technology?
Yeah, so I think, as we were saying earlier, I think some of it will be about our growing systems, and it'll be having systems which understand and support higher growth rates overall. So are dialed in to this sort of 1,400 micromole average. I was just over in MJ BizCon. I met you there, and I was talking to a lot of commercial growers there, and that's pretty much, grow lighting suppliers selling to commercial growers, and that's pretty much what they're specifying now is 1,400 micromoles. And that's because they're getting a good return for it. It's the best use of the space, and they're getting a good return. So that's almost twice the power intensity that home growers are using today. But if we figure out what strains are best suited, if we figure out what sort of nutrient schedules should be used, what sort of watering systems, what sort of media, etc., best support this high performance level, I think it's perfectly achievable. And as it would be a surprise to people 6-7 years ago who were running with metal halide and HPS that were pushing, in some cases, twice the yield per square foot that they would have been, even expert growers. because of this increased light intensity, I think they would be surprised. And I think we'll be equally surprised 3-4 years from now when we're looking back and seeing all these little incremental sort of changes that have occurred to put systems into place to support that higher return rate.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to look into the future myself and see, what is next for grow lights. And one of the things that come to mind that I'd like to see, and I think it would be achievable in the future, is having AI incorporated a little bit directly within the grow lights to where it can actually scan the plants and find out, okay, it needs more light. It'll automatically adjust the light up to where it needs. Or if it's smart enough to know that there's deficiencies, well, it's going to communicate to you and let you know that you need to increase your nutrients or whatever. But I think it probably could happen at some point in the future. Maybe not in the next couple of years, but maybe 5-10 years from now, we've got AI incorporated directly in the grow lights to where it's actually adjusting the light levels according to how the plants physically are.
Well, a really good example of that, and just cheap sensor technology that works really well and takes it away from sort of our perception or whatever our experiences are before that are maybe misleading us. And one of the ones for me is moisture sensors. It's so, I was growing in cocoa. I actually met Dr. Coco over in MJ BizCon. He was giving out to me because I hadn't been following his methods properly, and he was suggesting the same thing to me about using the moisture sensor. I did. And I have to say, I was overwatering and I didn't realize it, and sensor technology is getting cheaper. The integration of these sensors is getting cheaper. I'm really impressed with AC Infinity stuff, for example, where they've really brought the price down for integrating those systems together for the home grower, and made it much easier to use, and taking it away from our subjectivity, from our sort of biases based on past experience and or just lack of knowledge. And so whether it's helping you with nutrition and feed schedules, helping you with controlling your environment, dialing all those little factors in to prevent us making a mess of things for a start, which is always a bonus. But then getting those extra 5% all over the place, that those little 5% that all increment together to make a good grow rather than a disappointing grow, which we've all had those experiences where we look back and we're just not sure what happened. We're just not sure why it went wrong, what was different, what I thought I did everything exactly the same and it turned out different. And if we had, as you say, AI knitted into that, where we're able to feed inputs and outputs into a system where we're diarizing things effectively online or through these devices, I think there's huge potential there to prevent disasters or disappointments, and to boost performance.
Yeah, I think it can be really helpful for sure. We will just have to wait and see. All right, Shane, I have taken up enough of your time, but I want to let the listeners give them an opportunity to follow you. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you and what you have upcoming in the future?
Yeah, sure. Whatever platform you're on, generally I'm on MIGRO. So just look for MIGRO or MIGRO Light, at MIGRO Light across YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. On the website, migrolight.com. Lots of blog posts there with lots of the things we've just discussed. But as much information as I receive, I put out there as quickly as I can, as concisely and accurately as I can. And so hopefully, you find it a good reference point. If you're selecting grow lights, I've got a lot of comparisons and reviews in terms of setup and optimizing, using power meters, all that stuff, all covered. And love to get your feedback too as well. So I look at as many comments as I can. I answer as many of them as I can, and I listen as much as I can to people and try to provide them with the information that they want and need.
I'll definitely have a link to Shane's channel down in the YouTube description section below. And if you're on one of the podcast platforms just listening, search for him. You'll find him. It'll show right up once you Google MIGRO, both his website and channel as well. And I want to pass a question off to the audience. Last question I asked you was, what's the future of grow lighting technology? And I want to hear what the audience is saying about this. So if you have any input, if you have any thoughts on where grow light technology is going, drop them down in the comments section. I'd love to read those. One last thing to mention would be the other episode. So I'll link it on the outro card, which should be on the screen right now if you're tuned in on YouTube. So click that right there and you can tune into the last episode Shane and I did together. Shane, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Peace out, everyone. Catch you in the next episode.